Welcome back to Made to Be Whole. This week, we're going to talk a little bit about controversial statements that have been made recently regarding autism. My husband says if I do this episode right, everyone will hate me. Stay tuned to see if he's right.
Made to be Whole is intended for informational purposes only. It's not intended to replace the advice or care of a licensed healthcare professional. Participating in this podcast does not constitute a provider-patient relationship with Krista Michener, AHP Integrative Health, or any of the guests featured on Made to be Whole. Krista Michener, AHP Integrative Health, and any featured guests aren't responsible for any losses, damages, or liabilities that may arise from use of information obtained in this podcast or associated materials. Please consult a healthcare professional for any health-related concerns that you are experiencing.
So, this is Krista. There have been a lot of things said recently in the news about autism, and there have been a lot of emotional reactions on all sides of the spectrum. Our current Health and Human Services Secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., made some statements about autism and the prognosis for kids with autism that was pretty bleak. He's looking into vaccination as a potential cause of autism. I saw a lot of posts on social media about how terrible he is and that autism is a gift and this is awful. This is leading to the marginalization of children with autism and we shouldn't be questioning anything. And that kind of made me want to vomit too. I'll tell you why. I am a mom of two kids with autism, one adopted, one biological. So I feel like I can say controversial things. So I do feel that all of my children are a gift, and I do feel that all of their challenges and quirks have helped me be a better person. But there's a big difference between the current kind of romanticization, if I said that properly, of neurodivergence in this subsection of the population that's just a little quirky and thinks different and does their things their way, but are super smart and still are working, making a difference in the world, versus autism that is incredibly disabling and can be life-changing and shattering to individuals and families. To me, when I think of something as a gift, I think, wow, this is so great. It's something that I want to give to other people. So let's parse out how autism's affected my life and see if this is something I'd like to give to other people. Would I ever say, oh, I hope that you have the gift of your child not being able to regulate their emotions? I love you so much. I hope you have the gift of them not being able to tolerate anything in their environment. I hope all clothes feel awful and that you can only find one thing that they will wear and buy it in 5 different colors. I hope you have the gift of your child having very restricted eating patterns. I hope you have the gift of your child not being able to interact with peers and being socially isolated. I think that's garbage. So that's some of the things that autism can do. There are some kids with severe autism who cannot dress themselves, who cannot verbally communicate, who cannot control their bodily functions, who will not be able to work. Are those children a burden to society? No. But is their life hard? Yes. If there are things that we can do to prevent or mitigate that risk, should we do them? Hell yeah. So, autism spectrum contributing factors. I have mentioned before, I am a member of MAPS, MedMaps. So they look a lot at root causes for lots of different special needs type presentations, including autism. They are a spinoff. I think the original group was DAN, DAN, exclamation point, Defeat Autism Now, which was started by parents. So all of these people who say people are saying autism is a problem or terrible, intolerant people, most of the driving force behind these movements and this research are parents who want better lives for their children. So if you think they're terrible people, I won't say the things that I'm thinking about you. So in the beginning of the neurodevelopmental report that Intelligence DNA does, they have a neurodevelopmental report that looks at autism spectrum, contributing factors. They look at neurodevelopmental research, a lot of different things. I want to read some of the things in the intro to the report. Autism has increased tremendously over the last few decades. While just 25 years ago, so that's half of my life ago, autism was reported in about 3 in 1,000 children in the US. The recent CDC data placed the risk of autism between 1 out of 36 and 1 out of 50 range. There are many components contributing to this increase, but it is clear that environmental exposures, changes to our food supply, and changes to our microbiome all contribute heavily. It is also important to consider that one's genomics also plays a role in relation to one's environment. So remember, genomics and genetics are a little different. When you look at genetics, the genes that you've inherited that are going to express themselves that we can't change anything. I always use the low hanging fruit of the genes that say Krista is short because I am 5 foot minus 1/4 inch. And there's nothing I can really do about that. And I don't really care. I don't think it's been a hindrance to my life at all. But then there are other genes that make us vulnerable to things, but whether or not those things express themselves have to do with exposures. So some of the genes that get looked at in this genetic report and that contribute to a risk of autism, you're not looking at a single gene. There's not like an autism gene that predetermines that this child will be autistic. And if you tested all of these kids who have been diagnosed with autism, that you will be able to identify them by this singular gene. But there are a lot of different pathways that contribute. So some of them are glutathione pathways. Glutathione is your master detoxification antioxidant, but it also regulates inflammation in the brain. Interleukin inflammatory regulators, glutamate, which is an irritating neurotransmitter. So for a lot of these kiddos or adults, you'll see in their report a glutamate GABA imbalance that they're more vulnerable, or other oxidative stress pathways. You also will find genes that might make them more vulnerable to gut permeability, autoimmunity, food intolerances, vitamin levels is a huge thing. People who cannot absorb certain nutrients, oxytocin, melatonin receptors. Looking at those factors plus BDNF, which I've mentioned before, brain derived neurotropic factor, whether or not the person can metabolize choline, which is uber important for brain function, and other detox pathways is also really important. So they've got all of these super cool panels, and you can go say, okay, what all is making this person vulnerable to this presentation? And what can we do to minimize symptoms they're already having, prevent further things, or just mitigate risk? One of the things that's become hugely unnecessarily controversial, in my opinion, is vaccines, which we've talked about recently. So if we look at that just from the context of genomics, I'm not even looking at data about what vaccines do or don't do, but is it not possible that if somebody is more vulnerable to the negative impacts of neurotoxins, that in said individual having multiple vaccines that have an aluminum adjuvant that's carrying the vaccine to the body, there's just, I think, one vaccine left that still has mercury, that person might be at higher risk for negative impact from vaccination. To say that all vaccines are safe and effective and it's completely proven, don't question the science, is moronic, because that's not what science does. Science that's good and established welcomes being challenged, welcomes tests because it's reproducible. So if you have a vulnerable individual and they go to a well visit and they say, hey, we want to give your kid basically 4 to 5 vaccines, and say they've got a little cold too, so their immune system's already down. So we're getting these multiple hits of just the aluminum alone. Let's forget about what the vaccination could do. It is absolutely possible that that could lead to a developmental decline for someone. And there are multiple reports of parents that you read about who had children who were developing typically, had multiple vaccinations, and had a precipitous decline that correlated immediately with the vaccination. Why on God's green earth would we not want to know who these vulnerable people are and prevent that from happening? If you don't want to do that, I think that you should question what you really care about. Are you really there to help people? even with these reports recently of measles outbreaks and how dangerous measles are, I'll tell you a few things that I've found out recently, and I welcome more information. I truly, truly do. I have seen some data that has shown that the precipitous drop in measles death actually happened before the introduction of the vaccine, that had already kind of dropped off and was phasing itself out. I know, though, that measles had been an ongoing problem in some third world countries and that some of those vaccination efforts have provided some protection. I also just read an article this morning, and again, I haven't vetted everything out, but that the child in Texas who died recently from measles, the family did an interview where they said, listen, all of our children had measles. This child got pneumonia also. The pneumonia wasn't well managed, and they actually died of pneumonia, but they've been made into a case study, a public relations effort by the pro vaccine community of why measles are so dangerous when actually this was a much more complex picture. You saw that happen widely during COVID. While there are many people, unfortunately, who died from COVID, you lost a lot of people's trust because things were misrepresented. If somebody died and they had COVID, COVID was very frequently listed as the cause of death, even if that wasn't what was going on. So that little massaging of data caused a lot of suspicion from people that has created a kind of wider chasm between the CDC and some of these agencies and the public. And now we have this dichotomy where we have people who are just non-trusting and pitted against each other when I think both sides have some truth. We should be able to trust everything that government agencies say, especially those that are overseeing healthcare. But we should have more honest, transparent communication. They should be willing to tell us when we don't know something. And there should be freaking informed consent where we're honest about the risks of something, or if we don't know the risks of something. To tell someone that the only risk of just a vaccination, we'll take that, is mild irritation at the injection site is garbage. There's nothing that's that safe. If you look at side effects of Tylenol, there's more than that. We need to be honest and let people make informed decisions. So that little rant has calmed down a little bit. And I'm going to go through some of the things that we see as risk factors for autism and to make you aware that there are children with autism with proper treatment who have huge increases in their quality of life. And that's amazing. You also have to be very, very careful when somebody has what is sometimes referred to as acquired autism, where they didn't have these developmental delays from day one. It's very different, a child who from the beginning everything was delayed versus a child who was developing typically and there was a sudden change, whether that is at 18 months or 3 years or later in childhood. You don't suddenly get autism when you're 12. Something else has happened to create neurological inflammation and dysfunction that has created that presentation. Now, I also know as a parent why sometimes you're desperate for diagnosis because it's the only freaking way that you can get help from the school system. I had to fight, fight, fight for one of my kids to get a proper diagnosis, even though there were early developmental delays, because the way the school systems were set up, unless you had that, you couldn't get the accommodations that your child obviously needed. So we have now these great laws that are supposed to help kids because now we can have IEPs and other plans that our children can get accommodations. But you have some school systems that are so stingy that unless you have specific diagnoses, they won't make the accommodations. And again, if we go back to that gift, to tell someone, I really, really hope that you have to pay thousands of dollars out of pocket for an independent investigation because your school system won't help. And I hope that you have to fight like crazy to get basic accommodations so that they can learn and function in school. I wish that gift for you. I don't think you've walked that path. So going back to the genes. So autism spectrum contributing genes, contributing risk factor SNPs. So some of them do have to do with glutathione. Glutathione, as we mentioned, is the body's master antioxidant. There are some people who, because of genetic factors, they have less ability to produce glutathione. Those lower glutathione levels can contribute to autism risk. And they also, because they're anti inflammatory, I think that's part of what drives it. If you've got lower glutathione levels, you're not going to be able to detoxify as well. And you are not going to be able to manage inflammation when it comes via from infection, toxins, other things. Things that increase glutathione production, yes, I've mentioned before, you can take glutathione. Sometimes that's really helpful. But I really like helping individuals boost their glutathione levels, encouraging the liver to produce it. So, sulforaphane-based supplements, sulforaphane is from broccoli seed extract. There are a couple of good ones out there. We really like Avmacol at our office. They've got some published research that has to do with autism and improvements just supplementing with Avmacol. NAC, N-acetylcysteine, for most people is a good add. Vitamins C, D, and E also help support glutathione production. So there are multiple different genes. There's not a single gene that you want to go test for to see if you have problems with glutathione production. You can obviously check the glutathione levels, especially intercellularly, and cysteine levels intercellularly. That's going to help us know if you have the right ingredients and how the production's going. But the best thing to do if you're looking at this big picture, to me, is some of this genetic testing along with really good micronutrient testing, and then looking at actual levels of toxins like an oat test, which is an organic acid test, mycotoxins, which is your mold metabolites, other things like that, heavy metals. Those things can help us get a better picture. There's another gene I will just throw out there, the glitteridoxin, and I don't know if I'm saying it right, GLRX gene, but this gene variant leads to oxidative stress. Oxidative stress means you've got some toxic oxygen molecules, that build up. You want your body to be able to clear them. That's why people talk about antioxidants, why antioxidants are important. But if you've got this gene variant, you're more vulnerable to getting that buildup of oxidative stress, inflammation, more of the decreased glutathione recycling, and that can lead to mitochondrial dysfunction. So we're finding that mitochondrial dysfunction is a really, really key factor in autism and neurodegenerative diseases. In my mind, I think of all of these insults. They hit you when you're young, you're more likely to have a neurodevelopmental disorder such as autism. If they hit you later in life, you're going to be more vulnerable to neurodegenerative diseases, which include Alzheimer's, ALS, MS, that sort of thing. So again, anything we can do to reduce oxidative stress is helpful. Sulforaphane and glutathione do. Hydrogen water, I've mentioned before on the podcast, could also be great for that. You can get a little hydrogen water generator. You just want to look for brands that have good third-party testing and have higher production of the hydrogen molecules. There are dopamine receptor genes that can be abnormal in patients with autism more than other individuals. And typically, if you look at reports of people, what I tend to see is somebody who has more severe symptoms has more of these genetic vulnerabilities. It's the accumulation of vulnerability. We all have vulnerability to autism or any neurodegenerative or nerve developmental issue because we have brains. If you have a brain, there's a risk it can go wrong. But if you have stacked vulnerabilities, you're going to be much more susceptible to environmental insults. You're going to be much more susceptible to infectious insults and those having negative impacts, just a lot of different things. So dopamine is responsible for motivation, reward, and even movement. So if you think about Parkinson's and how Parkinson's disease really is a movement disorder, it is largely related to dopamine signaling. So someone who is prone to more increased dopamine signaling has a higher risk for autism. And that also, because I have some of these genes, makes you much more vulnerable to anxiety. You're in that constant fight or flight. If you have someone who's nonverbal, you may see more of that restlessness, the kind of involuntary contractions, those sorts of things. There are things you can do in the supplement world and the medical world to kind of mitigate that. A lot of people have heard of interleukins. There are a lot of different interleukin genes. But if you have these genetic variants, you might be vulnerable to higher levels of interleukin 6, which, for example, is an important inflammatory molecule that can cross the blood brain barrier. That's the risk. It's one thing for something to cause inflammation in your legs or your stomach or your joints. Not that that can't be super uncomfortable, because it can. But if you have something that's capable of getting into the brain and causing inflammation in the brain, you're talking about brain fog, anxiety, or when it happens at a very young age, a developmental delay. There are other interleukin genes. Interleukin 1 beta gene is another inflammatory molecule. It can contribute to autism risk. A lot of people have heard of MTHFR. It's one of the more famous SNPs, the more famous gene variants. Now, my only issue with our obsession with MTHFR is people want to put it into that monocausal thing. They just want to check MTHFR, one gene. And then if they have it, they say, oh, I have MTHFR, I can't detoxify. It's so much bigger than that. If you have MTHFR, the MTHR variant, that SNP, knowing it is power, because you can do things to work around that. So you have to take methylfolate. You're going to want to take methylcobalamin instead of cyanocobalamin for your B12. Choline and riboflavin can help support the pathway. There are a lot of different things. Yes, does it make you more vulnerable to autism and difficulty detoxifying? Of course, but it's not a death sentence. And I think it's interesting that the one path, there's two different MTHFR pathways, but the C677T, they notice in studies that the effects of this gene on autism risk are generally much higher in countries without fortified foods. So a lot of our fortified foods do have folic acid in it. And so that is offsetting it, I think, for some people. We have also genes, the adrenal receptor beta 2 gene puts people more prone for higher adrenaline levels, which is that fight or flight response, which leads to higher cortisol levels, which is your stress chemical. People who have 2 copies of this gene, that's associated with a higher risk of autism. So there are things like ashwagandha and other supplements like bacopa that can help to lower the cortisol levels. Low carb diets can help lower cortisol. Using specific foods like delicious dark chocolate can help lower cortisol. There are genes that make it, as we said, more difficult for your body to clear toxic pesticides. So when you look at people who live on farms, who should be some of the healthiest people in the world, some of them are, but I have noticed that a lot of sickness for people who should be much healthier based on their lifestyle. And depending on how they farm or the fields surrounding them, the use of pesticides can cause neurological problems, especially for people with certain genetic variants. You will see this pattern, unfortunately, in some families, communities, of saying, well, it can't be pesticides. How could you blame that on that? Because all of these other people live here and they're fine. Congratulations, you have different genes. So again, look at vulnerability, look at exposure. There are some people who need to be much, much more cautious about using organic produce just because their body has a harder time breaking down pesticides. There is something called the Dirty Dozen. They put out this list every year, but basically it's a list of 12 foods, produce that contain the largest amount of the pesticides in our food supply. And even if you can just stick with that list of eating organic for the Dirty Dozen foods, you're going to drastically reduce your exposure to some of those things. So you can also have genetically a decreased ability to degrade toxins and other molecules that just build up as a natural result of all of our body's processes. Your body has a harder time taking out the trash. And then if you think about I'm going to hop back to the whole issue with mitochondrial function. Think about the problems with tone that some individuals with autism have, where some people are very lax, they don't have good tone, and it impacts motor development. That can be because of impaired mitochondrial function. So even if a child remains on the spectrum, if we can look at things to work around that genetic vulnerability, then we are going to improve outcomes in physical therapy and occupational therapy and other things that families are working really hard to do. One of the most interesting things that is such an easy fix if we would make this testing mainstream, there is something called a folate receptor antibody. So basically, there's an active form of folate that's needed to cross the blood-brain barrier. And people who have 2 copies of that SNP, they can develop what are called folate receptor autoantibodies. So autoantibody, an antibody against yourself. And just by addressing that and taking folinic acid, which in the prescription form is leucovorin, but there is also over-the-counter folinic acid, can be game changing for some individuals. Sometimes we have to use pretty high doses, but it can do really amazing things. And if you think about what is approved for autism in this country, medication. Risperdal is an antipsychotic. It also causes weight gain and it can cause akathisia, which is restlessness and motor problems. Now, are there some people who actually do benefit from some Risperdal? Absolutely. And if that helps you or your child, I don't think we should shut the door on that. I just find it ironic and distressing that we are part of a healthcare system that will hand out Risperdal to young children, but we're not checking to see if they have a decreased ability to get adequate levels of folate to their brain. ATP production is a big thing. Again, this is going to be best addressed through testing, which is genetic testing. And I love the nutrient testing because we want to see what are you missing that are the building blocks of ATP. ATP is cellular energy. That's that thing you learned about in the Krebs cycle in high school, which if you were like me, you might have had glossy look on your face and your eyes glazed over because it seems so ridiculous. But it's much more fascinating to me when I see how ATP production affects health in young people and throughout the lifespan, and that there are things that are part of that cycle that are really critical. We've talked before about the concept of a well-stocked pantry, that a chef who does not have a well-stocked pantry is going to be limited in what they can make from their home. And if you are running low on CoQ10, you're always going to struggle with mitochondrial function. If your omega-3s, those things are out of balance, then mitochondrial function is going to be impaired. So I could go on and on, obviously, and I will spare you, but I do strongly recommend not accepting that there's never any hope, that we suddenly, out of nowhere, have an increase in syndromes that were very rare 25 years ago, even more rare 50 to 100 years ago, and that you just have to accept that your child is going to suffer. Of course, that child is a gift. Of course, you value their life and you wouldn't trade them for anything. But I think any honest parent would tell you they would gladly trade their child's suffering for something that can help them function better in society. And I encourage you to be open minded, to not go with the knee jerk reaction to either camp, because I don't think there should be 2 camps. I think we should all be in the camp of truth, where we're all looking for root causes. We're all evaluating research, that if we're traditional medical, we're open to the fact that maybe everything we're doing isn't helpful and that there are natural or quote unquote alternative things that are beneficial. I think if you're in the natural camp, that you should be open to the idea that conventional medicine may have some things to offer, because in the end, it shouldn't be about what you take or don't take. It should be about identifying truth, finding root causes, and helping us and our children to heal and live the most joyful, productive lives that they can. So remember to have hope, because you were made to be whole.
Have a podcast question or suggestion? Text or call us on the podcast info line at 330-439-0686. Thank you for spending time with me today. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to be notified when new episodes release. And remember, you were made to be whole.